BBC Radio Cambridgeshire.
So conversation then this afternoon starts with an interesting doesn't really cover it, a really quite fascinating story. It's from Bobbie Neate. Now, she's a former resident of Cambridge. Her family had long-standing links with the city. She now lives elsewhere, but she's written a book called Conspiracy of Secrets, and it's about her stepfather, Louis Stanley, who was well known in the motor racing world back in the 60s and 70s. Rather forceful personality, both professionally and at home, where she alleges that he was quite terrifying and abusive as well. This book is in part that, but also a look at his life and why perhaps he was the kind of person that he was, and why his early years in particular were shrouded in some mystery. She's done a lot of digging and a lot of research, and she still is looking for certain answers to certain questions as well. But here she is, she and I, talking earlier on about how the aftermath of divorce really does change families, and who this person was who entered her family back then.
I was just so confused. I went to Bar and House School in Cambridge. My name was, well, I don't know what my name was, but I remember that I went from the top of the register to the bottom of the register, and of course to little people that's very important. I was sitting there waiting for my name, and suddenly my name was right at the bottom of the register, and I didn't really understand, and I have vague memories of a father with a clerical collar, but I didn't know whether that was true or not. I had an Uncle Louis that appeared. I didn't know who he was, or we had to call him Papa. It was very difficult before writing the book. I didn't even know what age stepfather appeared on the scene. He was such a terrifying person, and I was the youngest of four, and we were all absolutely terrified of him. So we didn't question. We weren't allowed to say anything that had happened prior to him entering our lives.
There was no questioning your mother's choice then?
No. Oh, absolutely no. And she was equally frightened of him. So, yes, it was a very terrifying childhood.
His is a name that perhaps people listening might well be aware of, Louis Stanley, mainly for his prowess in motor racing, and for a time was very famous indeed in Formula One back in the 60s and 70s. Around that time when Graham Hill was essentially burning up the track, he was part of that whole group, wasn't he?
He was. Yeah. Graham Hill was what I call a family friend. He was great fun, and he would be visiting the house or winking at me. I was a child, and or obviously I was a child, but I had to learn how to I felt I had to learn how to wink. I never did learn how to wink because Graham was so good at winking, but he was a very important part of my childhood, and he was always keen to talk to us children.
That's a rather more warm memory you hold than perhaps some that you do.
Yes. Yeah. But the interesting thing about Graham was that he knew that stepfather was able to pull strings. He understood that stepfather was a real manipulator and a liar, and he was always able to manipulate the motor racing world to his advantage, and Graham was one of the first to appreciate that, even though he was also worldly wise about Louis.
So you're describing someone, or you're getting towards describing someone who was, in your words, terrifying, a very forceful character in his professional capacity as well.
Yes, very. He could turn on the charm, but most of the time he would manipulate others. There's incidents that people at the time used to laugh about, like him kicking waiters. It was one of his favourite hobbies at Monte Carlo or one of the others at Grand Prix places, and that when the waiter didn't bring the right food or whatever, he would kick the waiter. It's all so bizarre, really, but on memory, but it was accepted at the time.
We're hearing from Bobbie Neate. Bobbie is from Cambridge. Her family is from Cambridge. And she's written a book called Conspiracy of Secrets, which is about Louis Stanley, her stepfather, and his parentage. He was the illegitimate son of a former Prime Minister. But in life, and as she knew him as her stepfather, she says that he was always the most mysterious of characters. There was always perhaps a suggestion that there was something incredibly vague at best about his early years, perhaps a bit more sinister at worst. She talks about his personality, his abusive personality as well. And here she is in conversation with us earlier on today, pointing towards those early years of Louis Stanley, which might explain a lot. None
of us ever challenged him. And of course that's why he was so clever in covering up his own roots, because we weren't allowed to ask questions. Of course, as we became slightly older and a little bit braver, we asked, about his own father, where he lived, where he went to school, but we always got either a swipe or sent to bed. So when we became adults, we suddenly thought, well, hey, hold on, this is all very suspicious, that he never mentioned his father, never mentioned anything about his own boyhood at all. So you've always been, or you always had been, quite suspicious about, as you say, his roots, his background. But whatever pattern of behaviour in his background led him to be the kind of adult he was. Yes, I mean, I can now see that he was taught to lie from the cradle. And in a very bizarre way, you have to feel sorry for the man, because this man was told that his name was Stanley, that he had a father, was told to say that he had a father, that his father was a cotton broker, and everything around him as a little boy, he must have told a lie. So no wonder when he became, when I knew him, when he was 50 or 60, he was an arch liar. So yes, I mean, can you imagine being knowing that your father had been, I don't know whether Louis knew that his father had been Prime Minister, but he certainly knew that he was illegitimate and that his mother was Venetia Stanley, because he met her quite frequently. So this man was driven by power, money and status. That was all the things that drove him. Do you think there was a certain amount of shame that drove him as well? We still use the word illegitimate to mean it hints at something shameful and hidden and deceitful. Yes, yeah. I do. Yes, he was utterly ashamed of his background and did his life duty to cover it up. It sounds as though you've always been intrigued by his character and background. At what point, Bobbie, did you decide this was worthy of further investigation? At what point did you decide to dig a little bit further into his life? I would never have done this if he had not started abusing my mother when she'd had a stroke. I was driven, because of the family situation, to dig deep, and it was very, very painful to dig that deep. I didn't want to know. It was one of these people who I'd buried everything in my young years, and I didn't want to know just how awful Louis was or had been. But I was driven to it, and it was the fact that we were trying to save our mother from a terrible situation that we did start to ask questions. And then we started to say, who was this man? Who were the two very strange women that lived in our house when we were children? One was called Home Granny and one was called Auntie Mamie.
Home Granny and Auntie Mamie. Who did they later turn out to be then?
His surrogate. Well, of course, that's all part of the story in the book. But I discovered that they were. Home Granny was the woman that Venetia Stanley's family found to look after the illegitimate child, and the adopted sister, Auntie Mamie, well, she was called the adopted sister, was actually the niece. And both of them changed their name to Stanley to cover it all up.
It already sounds desperately muddled. And deliberately so. This is what you found. This was all deliberate.
Yes, absolutely. It was a very, very clever cover-up. If I could just start with Asquith's relationship with Venetia. I mean, how did that get through all the politicians and all the scandal mongers at the time? Very clever, because Venetia Stanley was 35 years younger than Asquith, and most people would have asked questions. But Venetia was the best friend of Asquith's eldest daughter, Violet. And, of course, that name, all your listeners will know, was Bonham Carter. She became Bonham Carter. And so how they managed to cover that up is that Violet used to go around with her father to electioneering, meetings in Downing Street, etc. And, of course, her best friend, Venetia, went too. So it was all very cleverly done.
There's a hint that Herbert Asquith was actually very clever in orchestrating this affair, wasn't he? That it's said that he would rearrange high-level meetings in order to be with her. There was a lot of smoke and mirrors at the time, essentially, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. I mean, I would love to read out one of the letters that Asquith wrote to Venetia.
Please do, yeah.
When I got your letter, I at once postponed my interview with the King until noon, that we might have the hour 10:30 to 11:30 together. I wanted so much at the earliest opportunity to talk to you and get your opinions about today's War Council. I mean, that's just so shocking in so many ways.
But also, for a relatively young girl, how flattering to have a meeting with the King cancelled in your favour. I mean, as courtship goes, that's fairly interesting, isn't it? Have you uncovered any suggestion that there was any suspicion that people knew what was going on, that perhaps Violet was in on it as well?
I'm quite sure Violet was in on it, and Roy Jenkins, when he wrote the biography of Asquith, certainly asked Violet about the relationship. So I'm quite sure that Roy Jenkins was onto it. I'm very sad that he's not alive to ask him questions.
And of those that remain alive across all of these family threads, have people been prepared to talk more publicly now? With the passing of time, time can neutralise a lot, can't it? Have people been rather more open when you've approached them to chat?
No.
That's
the mysterious thing, because that's what makes me think I'm only on the start of something possibly even bigger. Was there another child? Well, there's the whole talk of the coalition in 1915 that Asquith acted completely out of character when he received the letter from Venetia, who was finishing the affair, and 5 days after he got the letter, he was a distressed man and agreed to a coalition where, days before that he was perfectly okay and saying, no way am I going to agree to have a coalition. So Yes.
And all of this happening back then, more than 100 years ago, when the country was at war, during the most unsettled of times. I mean, we know, of course, with history lessons, that extraordinary things do happen when the world is torn apart like this. So the background, in a way, is fitting, isn't it?
Yes. I think Asquith really completely fell apart he was a brilliant peacetime Prime Minister, but during the war he seemed to be like a broken reed and just being propped up by Venetia. And he just didn't have his eye on the job. Again, I can read out another letter, which will be fascinating to, if I may.
Yes, please do.
Winston Churchill, was in Asquith's cabinet. Obviously, he was a much younger man than we remember from the Second World War. Asquith wrote to Venetia, "How wise I thought that all you said in your letter today on these subjects, especially in reference to the personal qualities of Winston. Your intuition never fails you, and there's no colleague whose judgment I trust so much."
How interesting.
There's Venetia in her early 20s, not the slightest bit interested in politics. Just a young girl wanting the best out of life. And she was hedonistic. I mean, it's quite extraordinary.
What sort of life did she go on to lead then, in being unable to have such close contact as any mother I'm sure would wish with their son? How do you feel her life then unfolded? Well,
the interesting thing is that she became promiscuous. She married one of Asquith's colleagues in the cabinet, which shocked Asquith, of course, but it was a marriage of convenience. In my view, it was Venetia desperately trying to get away from this clinging elderly man who was more and more relying on her. So she married somebody called Edwin Montagu, a very brilliant politician, but he was more than likely gay. So it was a social marriage, and within a year Venetia was having an affair with Lord Beaverbrook.
Crikey.
Yeah, it was crikey. And not only that, Venetia went on to have a very promiscuous life. But the interesting thing about Louis and all the other elements is that she made, in her will, there is room for leaving money to an illegitimate son, or illegitimate children, because I've had the will analysed, and that's certainly possible that she did that.
She had no other children then, had she?
She did, and there was lots of mystery about that child as well, because again, the child was born out of wedlock.
You've talked about how Louis Stanley, you're really unclear how much he did or didn't know about his past. But do you feel if he knew something that perhaps your mother did as well?
No, I think my mother knew nothing. I think there were times that she was vaguely suspicious, but of him as a man, nothing to do with his background. But no, I don't think my mother had an inkling of any of it. Again, a very clever manoeuvre by stepfather was that my cousin told me, who's quite a bit older than me, said that when they married, they agreed that they would never talk about their previous lives. So my mother obviously was married to my father, but she, so I think stepfather manoeuvred it that it would protect her, but of course it wasn't at all. It was to protect him.
He sounds like a fascinating character for all kinds of reasons. And at times, quite sinister as well. For more on the story of Louis Stanley and his father, Herbert Asquith, and his mother, of course, you can read Conspiracy of Secrets, and I'm talking about a family here that had many links to Cambridge as well. Louis' links to Cambridge, again, there's a lot of mystery around certain things that he was said to have been up to in the city as well. There's more in the book. Our thanks to Bobbie Neate.
Just Talking Broadcast PR. The radio and television interview specialists. Need help with a campaign? Call us now. 0845 257 5970 or go to www.radiointerviews.co.uk.